So, last little section in our discussion of the nervous system overview and organization. We talked about all the components of the brainstem, the diencephalon. We talked about the cortex, but now we're looking at the functional areas of the cerebrum and the cortex. So we know the gyri and sulci, we know the fissures, and now just a brief separation of how those areas have specific roles. And those roles are a lot like the elements of a feedback loop or the roles of the nervous system. The roles are to interpret or receive signals, afferent signals, sensory information from the periphery. They integrate that information or associate it with some known, some expected standard, and then they act upon that information. If there's any mismatch, it might bring it back into line. So the areas of the brain fall into those general categories. There are sensory areas that receive the information. There are motor areas that send new instructions. And then there are association areas that connect different regions of the brain, process the information, understand where the body is and what needs to happen to get it where it needs to be. The association areas are the processing or integrative areas in the brain. So the sensory and motor, generally simple, single direction of nervous impulses. The association areas are complex. So think of understanding a language, knowing a word in one language that it means a concept in another, or if I gave you a pencil to hold on to and you closed your eyes, you could probably identify the pencil by touch. You have a concept of what a pencil is, but the information is not visual. You're not seeing a pencil, you're trying to interpret it with another tactile sense. So the associative areas are complex and link multiple areas together to create information. So you can imagine a plate, a serving plate, or a pizza pan you take out of the oven, really hot. You have memory in there as well if you've touched something hot and been burned before. The association areas link the other areas together. And there are a number of areas in the brain that we could discuss. Some of the important ones are highlighted here. The different colors represent different areas of the brain, and the numbers are from Brodmann's original study of the brain in 1909, where he identified how each region has a specific task or a role associated with it. But we're not going through the numbers in depth. I think it is worth mentioning a few of the important areas that we'll touch on in detail. The primary somatosensory area was one that I introduced when we talked about the features of the brain, and it's located on what's called the post-central gyrus. What does that mean? That's a big, long, complicated word, post-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus is the gyrus, the hill, the bulge, immediately posterior to the central sulcus. Remember that long, somewhat well-defined line that separated the temporal and parietal lobes? We talked about that last week. The post-central gyrus is the ridge immediately posterior to that. And that entire ridge is involved in somatosensory actions. We'll talk about what that might mean coming up. It's closely related to, it's the neighbor of, the primary motor area, which could indicate to you that these two might be in communication. You might receive information from areas throughout the body that then need to respond. So we get a sense from the arms or the feet, the legs, and maybe you need to activate that part of the body. The primary motor area would do that activation. It's the neighbor of the somatosensory area on the pre-central gyrus. The gyrus, the bulge, the hill that's immediately anterior to the central sulcus. So those two broad areas, in blue and in red, we'll look at in a bit more detail and understand how they work and what they do. Some other important areas that we're not going to touch on in depth are prefrontal cortex, where a lot of our intelligence is assumed to come from, some more than others. That's what allows us to process and think and imagine the future and understand tricky concepts and survive better than other species have, the prefrontal cortex. And some of you have been in lab already. You've noticed we've done the eye dissection, you've seen the optic nerve. Those eventually go all the way back to the primary visual area, all the way to the posterior part of the brain. The occipital lobe, primary visual area, sits right at the back of the brain, which is why if you ever hit the back of your head, you start to see stars, or why you always want to try to protect the back of the head. In MMA, that's a big thing, hitting to the back of the head so you don't impact the visual cortex. And there's a couple other areas, as you can see listed here. I'll touch on like a language area. It's kind of interesting, but we won't go through too many in detail. Let's look at the primary somatosensory area. Primary somatosensory area. This is the main area in the brain that registers those afferent senses from the body. And every point on the body maps to a region on that post-central gyrus. So understand this concept first, and I'll show you a picture that helps make sense of that. Every area of the body maps to a specific region in the somatosensory area. So part of that area deals specifically with sensations on your big toe. Part of that area deals specifically with sensations at your hand, back of your neck, nose, etc. Every area in the body maps to a specific region. Now, those regions are related to association areas that might need to act. So they're in close relationship, for instance, to the motor area that might need to move your hand away from a flame. And generally, they're also related to other areas that we're going to leave as sort of a nebulous black box. The idea that if you receive information from your hands when you're holding the pencil, your eyes are closed, you're receiving somatosensory information from your fingertips, you can make a picture of what that item is through the association areas linked to those portions of the somatosensory cortex. And the kind of information that we are receiving throughout this post-central gyrus, this main area, are physical. Itch, tickle, sensation, heat, pain, limb position, proprioception. Are your hands clenched or are they open? That kind of information, somatosensory information. Somatic sensory information. Now, the image that you have in your slides that I'm showing you here depicts how that entire area maps to the body as a whole. And so this is a cross-section through the post-central gyrus, and you're looking head-on to one hemisphere. And from the most medial portion all the way lateral, the cartoon shows you the relative influence or the amount of sensation coming from a given area. And the overlay, the cartoon, shows you where in the brain the information from the face enters, or the feet enter. And this kind of diagram is called a sensory homunculus. And homunculus translates as little man. And it's distorted, but most of the areas, pretty much all the areas of the body are depicted here. So information coming from your toes and your feet and your heel are interpreted within, on the surface, within the fissure, the main longitudinal fissure. You have a lot of sensory information from places like the hands and the face and the lips. They're very sensitive. to somatosensory information, whereas you don't have a lot of information from things like the kneecap or the elbow. You don't need a large amount of somatosensory information from those locations. So every area in the body maps to some part of that post-central gyrus. You can see the names of the places as well listed there. So very similarly, this is where all the information comes in from the periphery, the somatosensory information. If we need to activate these regions, we do so through the primary motor cortex, which has a very similar layout. So this is spread across the precentral gyrus. It's the neighbor of the somatosensory area. We can also draw, in this case, a motor homunculus that shows where the nerves are heading to in the body to activate muscles. Again, each point on the body maps to a specific motor area. These areas are those that would be active if you need to clench your fist or do something voluntary. The primary motor area deals with that conscious motor activation. And again, the larger areas show where more motor fibers are transmitted. So you have really fine motor control in places like your lips and your jaw and your hands. You can do really complex, fine movements in those areas that have a lot of nerve fibers innervating them. Whereas you don't need fine, complex movements at the elbow. You can only flex or extend your elbow. But in order for me to articulate words and make enunciation and crescendo and get across ideas that you understand, I need really fine control of muscles of the throat, my lips, my jaw, etc. Okay, I'm debating on whether we get into these special areas. We're going to talk about them briefly. It won't take too long. A couple examples of associative areas that are more complex but somewhat easy to grasp relate to language. So with language, the concept of language isn't physical. You can't sense language. You have to relay a word to some other meaning. You have a concept of what a computer is, or the stage, or a chair, or the screen. But that word in English is not the same word as in French, or Italian, or German, yet if you spoke those languages, you'd all be able to understand that I was referring to one thing. So I'm making associations between different areas in the brain. And Broca's speech area is one really important area that allows you to sense, to understand, to process, and then deliver speech. So you can see it tucked in right here near the parietal lobe. It's the left border of the temporal lobe on the frontal lobe for most people. On the left-hand side, and there's a corresponding place on the right-hand side that we'll talk about in a second that is connected to and relays some of this information. And this is primarily important in executing patterns of talking and saying words. So as I say words, I need to be able to say them. I have to articulate my lip muscles, my throat muscles. I have to then schedule breathing within that. I have to be able to take breaths so that I don't interrupt my idea. There's a continuous flow of information. It activates the muscles of the diaphragm, the muscles of the intercostals to get all of those things working together. And if I have a particularly long-winded sentence, I have the ability to squeeze out a few more words without breathing. And then I take a longer pause in order to correct for that. That's part of the organization done by Broca's speech area. And so the speech patterns that are delivered are more complex. Breathing is relatively simple. It's in or out. The timing might be a bit complex, but the integration of those two is what is achieved by this associative area in the frontal lobe, speech and breathing. So this is tasked with the execution of dictation. I can sit here and talk because of the coordination of this area. And I'm doing so in English. And the concepts that I've identified, I'm thinking about and saying in English words, but if I were lecturing to you in French, which I won't try because I can't do it very well, I'd also need to involve the corresponding area on the right-hand side of the brain, in the right hemisphere. Yeah, this is supposed to be right, temporal lobe. Broca and Wernicke's area are in the right areas of the temporal lobe. So they decipher meaning, and then through association with whatever the concept is, and coordination by Broca's speech area, they can say, okay, well now you could speak in French and make long, cohesive statements to introduce what a concept is or how to learn a functional area of the brain, etc. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into detail on those, but they're an example of how different concepts can be linked together. They're an example about how a table can be understood in English and in French, and I can talk about that table effectively. Even in that little introduction, you can see how much more complex those concepts are than simply sensing itch on your fingertip or your nose, and then scratching your nose through the actions of the somatosensory and motor areas. Let's wrap this up because I want to get into some new information before we call it for today. There's been a lot in this section, and the summary slide isn't even what we've learned, it's pointing at the things you should focus on. So we structured the nervous system, or we divided the nervous system based on structure, is it central or not, and on function, which seems to be more appropriate. Are these outgoing signals or incoming signals? What are their jobs? Are they voluntary actions or are they involuntary? So the functional divisions of the nervous system are probably a bit more apt in understanding how it's organized. The central nervous system was our focus in this section, the brain, the spinal cord. We talked about how it's protected. There are two main areas of the central nervous system that are wrapped in protective coverings, and then that whole complex is buoyed by the cerebrospinal fluid that's produced in the ventricles, leaves through the apertures, bathes the entire central nervous system, and then returns to the blood through the arachnoid villi. Constantly produced, constantly recycled, protects from physical concussion, etc., the central nervous system. We only briefly scratched the surface of the structures in the brain. The brain, not the central nervous system. We still have to talk about the spinal cord, but we looked at some of the roles of parts of the brainstem, the medulla, the midbrain, the pons. There were a few interesting actions that each of those did that might relay information and connect different parts or different senses to different parts of the brain. Those that I identified were worth noting. There's a lot more that we didn't talk about. We talked about the diencephalon as well. We talked about the cerebellum and the coordination of motor actions. Again, in brief. And all of those areas we consider the lower order areas of thinking, the lower order areas of processing. The higher order thinking, intellect and complex emotion, complex thought, comes from the cerebrum. With its gyri, its sulci, the fissures, the incredible surface area that's developed over time and then been broken up and divided into areas that deal with specific tasks. So the two that we looked at today that are most important are the somatosensory and the motor areas. We know that the areas are divided into motor, sensory, association. And we looked at what an association area might look like that connects many different areas together to create a more complex role in the brain. A lot of information, which is why the midterm is this Friday and not in 2 or 3 weeks, because we're only adding more, right? It's a good thing that it's this Friday. Let's add more information. Oh, I just completely closed PowerPoint. Let's add more information because in lab this week, this information will be useful, and some of you that have been through lab already yesterday will have some experience with what we're going to talk about next. So we're still in the central nervous system, and this is grossly abbreviated from even what I did last year. The new slides are online. You can see them on Moodle. It's a generally shortened discussion of cranial nerves and the spinal cord. What I want to do in this chapter is identify the cranial nerves. These are very special nerves. The majority of nerves in the body arise from the spinal cord and go out to other tissues. But really important nerves don't wait for the spinal cord. They arise from the brain proper. We'll talk about how the spinal cord is structured. You've got some experience from lab already, or you will when you go to lab this week. There's a one-way flow of information in the spinal cord, and we will go into detail on how reflexes are generated and what a reflex is later on, which is one of the functions of the spinal cord and how it conveys information between the body and the brain. And then we'll focus on reflex arcs. You don't have to think about if you put your hand down on a thumbtack or you step on a nail like in Home Alone, you would jump back without even processing that information. That's an example of a reflex arc. So we'll talk about that in a bit of detail later on as well. But today, we are only focusing on number 1, cranial nerve structure and function, and we're not even looking at all 12 cranial nerves. But you have that information in the notes. It's also in the textbook if you want to go through and review, but the ones that I bring up are the ones that are important for the midterm. So there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're listed in an exhaustive table, and it's quite boring. It's a dull gray. There's different columns that tell you what the name of the nerve is and what it does. We're going to look at some of these examples. I'll show you a trick to be able to memorize the order and whether it's sensory or motor information or both. 12 nerves shown here, all very complex. They deal with actions and senses within the head, and I'll say the core. So one of the nerves that we'll see will innervate and bring information to the visceral organs in the thorax. All of the places that are really sensitive or important in maintaining normal function. So 12 cranial nerves can easily be remembered in order using the mnemonic O, to touch and feel, very green vegetables, Olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. Okay? And I wasn't looking at my screen at all because I was standing up here in front of you. You can do the same thing. O, to touch and feel, very green vegetables, or heaven. Some people use that. Some people swap in different words for vegetables. It doesn't really matter. This is an easy way to remember it. It's cheesy. It's going to get stuck in your head, and that's fine. You want to know what cranial nerve 7 is? O, to touch and feel. Facial. Now, done. You know all the words in order. You can name any cranial nerve. What information do those nerves convey? The information is either sensory, coming from the periphery, or motor, going to the periphery, trying to execute a task. Sensory, motor, both, sensory, both, motor. Easy, right? That's where this mnemonic will help. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Yeah, question in the back. It can be on the midterm. It's in today's class. Yeah. If it's on the midterm, I'm not going to ask you to recite everything in order. If we focus on one or two nerves in detail, you might focus on those nerves only, and you'll be fine. Good clarification, though. Eligible for the midterm. But these phrases, these mnemonics, will help you. How about, without looking, I will in a second. Tell me what cranial nerve 5 is. What do you think? Cranial nerve 5. To touch. Well, you guys all have it in front of you, but yeah, trigeminal. If you were asked what the information was that trigeminal carried, some say marry money, but it's both. There's information coming back from the periphery, sensory information, and motor information. Olfactory, for instance, the nerves that relay information related to smell. Some, only sensory. Well, that makes sense. The olfactory nerves that convey smell information, they don't do any motor activity for smell. Smell is only a sense. So smell is only sensory. So these mnemonics, easy to remember, very cheesy, tell you the order, can help you identify the names and certainly the information that those nerves are carrying. Now what I want to do just briefly in the next 15-ish minutes is look at a couple. We'll just look at a couple. And what if, how about this? There'll be some give and take. We'll trade off. Let's say that this can be on the midterm, the information about the type or the name. But as we go into detail, I won't ask you specific questions about the nerves. Okay? So let's cut it off here. It'll be like a little concession, a little give and take. But you'll see quickly the information that we're going to talk about, it's all in the names of the nerves. Olfactory. The olfactory nerves. The olfactory sense is the one dedicated to smell. These nerves tell you when you're smelling something and what you're smelling. These are obvious on the brains or on some of the brains in lab. The bulbs are they're like round whitish flaps right at the anterior ventral side of the brain. The cartoon showing here, they look a lot bigger on a sheep brain because the brain is much smaller. They take up relatively more space. The olfactory nerves are triggered in response to chemicals in the air, aromatics, different things that trigger scent, and relay that information to the brain so you know when you're smelling cinnamon buns or something spicy or fresh spruce trees outside if you're going for a walk. Even though these originate from the brain, smell doesn't get right into the brain. Smell is outside. It's around us. It comes in through the nose. So we need a way for these nerves to sense something outside of the body. If you were to think about where they were, they're probably in the middle of my head, right at the bridge of my nose here, inside the skull, but projections come out through very tiny holes in the base of the skull that will sense any of those aromatics or volatile compounds that might be in the air. Hopefully they're pleasant. That part of the brain that has the little holes that allow the nerves to come out is called the cribriform plate. And we're zooming in, looking at the olfactory bulb in the middle and many little small neurons that pass through these holes. There's epithelium within the nose. This is simple pseudostratified epithelium, right? You guys knew that. And these nerves, the body of the nerves are blue, the axons are also blue. They squeeze between these epithelial cells and sit right inside the nasal cavity. So if you smell something deeply, and there's an aromatic particle or substance, it can come into contact with these nerves and relay that information to the brain. You can smell something and you know what you're smelling. These are special nerves that don't respond to light, they don't respond to pressure. Instead, they respond to odor. And odor is a broad class of different stimuli. Many different small chemicals, different molecules that would bind to and trigger some activity in these neurons. So something goes in, triggers the ends of these neurons that's relayed to the olfactory bulb, that's interpreted by the brain as smelling like something. If you were paying attention in the last section, we talked about how the sense of smell can be associated, for instance, with memories. So a sense of smell originating here would travel down the axons in the olfactory nerve. It gets processed primarily in the olfactory area of the temporal lobe, but then it connects to parts of the limbic system. Remember we mentioned that smell can register emotion or memory. You can have a feeling related to smell. That was done specifically through those habenular nuclei and the hypothalamus. Smell was the odd sense out. It was the primary sense that wasn't relayed through the thalamus. This one was special. It stood apart, connected to the limbic system through the habenular nuclei in the epithalamus. If I asked you something about this on the midterm, you can't come back enraged, out of sorts, saying, well, you said it was after cranial nerves, and then we talked about it later, and now it's on the test, because we talked about this last week, right? So you can't be upset. But if I asked you a question about it, it's fair game. Olfactory nerve, first cranial nerve involved with and dealing with only the sense of smell. Other important senses and other important nerves that you'll see in lab this week. The optic nerve. Sure, I can smell my way around the world, but I'm losing a lot of information if that's the only sense I'm relying on. I'd like to be able to collect visual information from the periphery and know when someone has a hand raised. If I don't see them, then hopefully there's an auditory stimulus. Or see when someone's falling asleep or scrambling to catch up. I can see that and hopefully adjust. The optic nerve collects that information. Those of you that were in lab yesterday and are heading to labs later will want to pay special attention to the retina, which is this entire top portion of the graph. In lab, it just looks like a floppy little bit of connective tissue you can discard. But it contains all of these complex rods and cones and sensory neurons that respond to light, that can respond to shapes or intensities of light, and then all that information is relayed through the retina to the optic nerve. So the retina lines the inside of the eye, and all of these neurons collect and run along the back of the eye, the inside surface, and collect at the optic nerve. The optic nerve is probably one of the most easily identified cranial nerves. It's obvious, it sits right on the ventral surface, and one of the defining characteristics is the X shape, the chiasm. Some of the neurons switch sides. I'm not going to talk about that in detail. Some of them do. And so the optic nerves merge and then diverge again at the optic chiasm, a very easily identifiable structure on the ventral side of the brain. This is actually still hotly debated on whether this is a nerve or part of the brain. Whether the eyes are central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. And there's good arguments in both camps. So some people will say that the eyes are really just a projection of the brain. It's part of the brain that sticks out a little bit. It's not peripheral. It's central nervous system. And some people will say, well, there's a long conduit with signals running back and forth, or back. Some say, yeah, it's only sensory information. So it's apart from the central nervous system. It's part of the peripheral. I'm not going to ask you which one it is or the other because that's still controversial. But some people say the eyes are just bulging of the brain proper. Since we talked about eyes, and you will see them in lab, notice these nerves, or the optic nerve, these neurons, only relay information from the periphery to the brain. They eventually go through to the primary visual cortex. We introduced that today. But they do nothing to allow me to look around. This information is only delivering sensory information. Oh, don't worry about that. I'm not asking you anything about that. The nerves that move your eyes around are separate. Oculomotor, it's in the name. Oculo, eye, motor, motor. This nerve deals with movement of the eyes. Oculomotor is the third cranial nerve. You can see the branches as they arise from just posterior to the optic nerve, the optic chiasm. They innervate muscles around the eye. They're heavily involved in lifting, vertical movement, medial movement, if you can cross your eyes, and then opening the eyelids. Eyelids are some accessory structures in the eye. So a lot of the eye movement comes from oculomotor nerves. Now that makes sense. The name says what it does. Medial movement of the eye, vertical movement of the eye, and it can activate some of the accessory structures. So in lab, you'll talk about the ciliary muscles, the eyelids, the iris. You'll see them, you'll dissect them and separate them out. Those are also controlled by the oculomotor nerve. Now for our purposes, movement of the eye and the discussion about movement of the eye, I'm going to leave there. You might be wondering, on this graph, or on this figure, I see a branch of cranial nerve 3. I also see a branch of cranial nerve 4 and 6. If we were to continue our discussion, you'd see that they also play a role in moving the eye, but for our intents and purposes, for our understanding, we are leaving it with just the oculomotor nerve. But be aware, it's not the only player. Let's talk about one more nerve and we'll call it for the day. The second most easily identified nerve on the ventral surface of your brain, the biggest of the cranial nerves, the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal. Trigeminal. 3 twins. There are 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve. The name doesn't tell you what it does in this case. Luckily, I'm going to tell you what it does. The name doesn't tell you, but I'll tell you. You will easily be able to identify the trigeminal nerve on the majority of the specimens in lab. It's an obvious large protrusion from just beside the pons. Oh no, sorry, the midbrain. There should be 2 of them. Some of them might be chopped off because there's connective tissue that you have to remove. Trigeminal nerve is obviously apparent. It's the largest of the cranial nerves. And there's 3 branches. You can see the names, but I'm not going to emphasize the names. What I want to emphasize is, some say marry money, but, okay, there's information on the sensory side and motor information being carried by this nerve. I want to look at what that information might be. Trigeminal nerve deals with a lot of the muscles of the face and chewing. So one of the branches is purely sensory. And if it hasn't been obvious to you, blue boxes are sensory, red boxes are motor. So far they've all been, no, they haven't all been. The first 2 were sensory, oculomotor was motor, blue boxes are sensory, red boxes are motor. So the first branch deals with information on eye position that can help inform movements of the eye. So part of the trigeminal nerve can give information on where you're looking. As we move a little bit inferior, the trigeminal nerve innervates the face beneath the eyes, the upper jaw, the cheeks. We get information on touch and movement of this area of the face just inferior to the eye socket. Those are 2 separate branches. The third branch is just slightly more complicated. The third branch also carries sensory information. As you're moving down, the third branch carries sensory information from the jaw and the skin around the lips. So the trigeminal nerve largely gives information about the front of the face. Sensory information about the front of the face, the eyes down to the chin. The small bit of motor activity that it does have is in innervating the muscles of chewing. The names of those muscles aren't important, but when you chew, you decide to chew, if you're chewing gum right now, that signal is being sent through this third branch of the trigeminal nerve. We will see the names for each of these branches later when we talk about the structures of the face and the head. I'm not going to emphasize them right now, but they will become more obvious what we mean by mandibular, maxillary, and ophthalmic when we talk about the structures of the head and the face specifically. 3 branches, they all have sensory information. One of them innervates the muscles of chewing, front area of the face. Let's leave it there. I want to introduce one more cranial nerve when we get back to class on Thursday. We're going to do some review on Thursday as well and prep for the midterm. Thursday's information is not on the midterm. Have a wonderful day studying. Email me if you need to. Come to office hours. Good luck.